Part of the left's long march through our institutions has been the constant denigration of our history. The Marxist left, that sees everything through the prism of oppressed and oppressors, has decreed that our history is a long tale of shame, essentially the story of a world ruined by Western colonialism, British colonialism especially. With democracy under increasing challenge from aggressive dictatorships, we need strong leadership now more than ever. Yet so often the leaders we have spend more time apologising for our countries than defending them. Joining me now to discuss how we turn this around, or even if we can, thinker, author and Professor Emeritus of Moral Theology at the University of Oxford, Nigel Bigger. Well, Nigel, welcome to the program and welcome to Australia. Across the West, we've seen ongoing turmoil since October 7, but it's been particularly pronounced in places like Australia and the UK. I mean, have you been surprised by what we've seen?
Yes, Peter, I was surprised when I first fell into the culture war and colonial history in December 2017. I had no idea that my view that the British Empire involved both good and bad, which seems a commonsensical view, was so controversial. So I was completely surprised by it. I think views that were common sense 10 years ago are no longer common sense. And one reason has to do with the upsurge in the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May 2020, which, as you know, has a very stark view of the opposition between white and black, between white supremacists and black victims. And I think that's highly responsible for the very polarised view that seems to predominate at the moment.
What about since October 7, though? I mean, I have been ashamed of what I've seen on the streets of Australia. Yes, it's a minority, but I would never have thought our country would be in the position where Jews feel safer in a war zone that's now Israel than they do on the streets of Melbourne and Sydney. And I know that's been a feature of what's been happening in the UK. How do you see all of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's connected with the decolonising story, isn't it? Because a lot of these folk see Israel as a settler colonial state and the Palestinians as poor indigenous peoples robbed of their land. The actual history is a whole lot more complicated than that, but that stark binary narrative of black versus white helps to feed this frenzy, this political frenzy over Gaza. Yes, I was shocked by the intemperance of the protests and also the weakness of the authorities in dealing with them. That's partly because, of course, certainly in my country and probably here too, we have a significant Muslim population whose natural affinity is with the Palestinians.
Okay, so we know what the problem is. How do we get the narrative back from the left? Because they've captured our institutions. They're certainly very much listened to by younger generations. How do we get our nations back on track?
The first thing is that some people need to start speaking the truth, and that's what I've tried to do in my book on colonialism. I don't whitewash the British Empire and pretend nothing bad happened under it. Any long-standing state, and the British Empire lasted 400 years and stretched from Newfoundland to New Zealand, is going to involve bad as well as good, and the British Empire certainly did. But the whole truth is the British Empire achieved some remarkable things, not least the abolition of slavery across the world from Brazil to New Zealand. And so we need the whole story out there. We need more people to tell that story. And the good news is that there are lots of people out there, I think a majority of people who don't know much history, but who suspect that the cartoonish caricature of our colonial past, our imperial past, is not true. And they're hungry for a more sensible, balanced point of view. And the fact that Quadrant magazine has seen fit to bring me to Australia to do a speaking tour suggests they think there's an appetite for it.
Yeah, I should declare at this point I'm on the board of Quadrant, but I had a good look at your book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. You're trying to give us all a very balanced account. You said there you acknowledge the bad as well as the good. I think there's plenty of good. I think the good outweighs the bad. But here in Australia, that debate about colonial settlement of Australia has got to the point that we can't acknowledge our national day anymore, January 26th, without great controversy. I think we're starting to see a bit of a fight back on that point. But, you're an historian. On balance, was the British settlement of Australia good or bad?
Well, first of all, Peter, this is a really important fight to win because the decolonising story calls into question the legitimacy of Australia, of Canada, of the United States, and of 400 years worth of British engagement with the world. And what's at stake here really is the record of a very important part of the West. And right now, when the West is being threatened by autocratic regimes like Russia and China, we don't need our self-confidence to be corroded by a highly distorted, politically destructive narrative. As for Australia, well, look, again, in the course of colonisation, bad things happened, but many Aboriginal peoples actually found the settlers attractive, partly because the settlers were able to provide more food. So the story in Australia, contrary to some accounts, is not simply one of opposition. There's also accommodation and fascination. And as for whether Australia turned out better than worse, well, look, Australia is one of the most prosperous, one of the most liberal countries on earth. And I noticed in the latest World Values Survey, data from 2022, Australia, Canada, Britain and the US appear to be among the least racist countries on earth, much less racist than China or Iran or Russia. So yes, Australian history contains lots of bad as well as good, but the trajectory has been very positive. And so we're in a situation now where I believe 80% of people with indigenous blood in Australia are prospering more or less like the average Australian. There are 20% who are languishing in remote communities, but most people with Aboriginal blood are prospering in Australia, and I think that needs to be underlined.
I think most of my audience watching tonight would agree with that sentiment. Nigel Bigger, thank you for your time and welcome to Australia. As I said, look forward to catching up with you soon.